Okay then, so sorry for the long delay in getting these videos out. Um, Online school is proving to be a bigger time consumer than I thought. This is chapter 14, which covers the presidency. So the learning objectives for this video be: number one, explain how presidents differ from prime ministers and the rise of divided government in the United States. Two, summarize how the constitutional and political powers of the presidency have evolved from the founding of the United States to the present. Three, explain the importance of persuasion for presidential policymaking. Four, discuss why presidential character and organization matter for policymaking. Five, describe presidential transitions and their consequences for presidential power. So back then, just a small few won in direct election if you wanted Congress to choose the president, but many didn't want the president to be a tool of Congress. The Electoral College itself was a last-minute invention, and most people thought that the House of Representatives would end up picking the president anyway. Now it's quite different. The House of Representatives hasn't chosen the president since 1824. For each election cycle, years of campaigning and billions of dollars are raised, put into the cycle. Presidents are weaker than many prime ministers, but the presidency is definitely compared to that of a monarch in terms of power compared to the intentions of the founders, hence the term imperial presidency. So, in a parliamentary system, these are like the different government systems of modern democracies. So the parliamentary systems, what we find in the UK and the vast majority of other democracies, the prime minister is selected by the legislative majority, and there's no fixed term, and they can be removed or any time, or can stay in office as long as they want, provided that their party is in the majority of the seats, and that the party approves of this person as the prime minister. Now, we have a presidential system in which where the president and the legislators are elected separately. They serve fixed terms, and they're least likely to honor their campaign promises just because of the divided government nature that we find here, because the presidents and the legislators are elected separately. In a semi-presidential system is what you find in France. The prime minister is selected and subject to parliamentary majority. However, the president is separately elected. There is a separately elected president, and he is quite powerful, despite technically being only the head of state. Now, presidents are often outsiders. Since 1828, only 13% came from Congress. Presidents choose cabinet members from outside of Congress, and presidents have no guaranteed majority in the legislature. And even then, Congress is much more independent. Only FDR and LBJ really had any serious control over the House of Representatives, and they were acting in extraordinary times. FDR came into power during the Great Depression and the Second World War. LBJ, was really big when it came to Vietnam and the Civil Rights era. So the United States has had divided government for 2/3 of the time since 1952. The president, this is when the president comes from a different party than the majority of one or both chambers of Congress. However, divided government surprisingly has not been much more gridlock than unified government, as ideological factions within parties are also sources of gridlock. So the idea of party unity is kind of a myth, and many Americans seem to like and want gridlock as it protects liberty. And gridlock is seen as a feature, not a bug, of the representative democracy, especially one of the United States with the separation of powers. Oops. So the powers of the president are formally set out in Article 2. Technically, it says that they wield executive power. They are a commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This is supposed to ensure that the civilians are in control of the military, because if you ever read history, there's a lot of coups. History is full of the military overthrowing civilian government. The president is supposed to take care that laws are faithfully executed. They grant pardons and reprieves for federal offenses, and they appoint all but top officials without advice and consent. They can even fire some top officials. So the president, he shares these powers to the Senate, making treaties, appointing ambassadors, judges, and other high officials. And basically, the president and the Senate can advise and consent each other, basically approve of each other. So basically in terms of powers, the president shares with Congress as a whole, approve legislation, appointing the vice president, appointing a vice president to fill a vacancy. Now, this is the only time the House of Representatives is involved in human resources or staffing. Oh, sorry. I was just blanking out there for a second. So, the question of presidency was a huge issue at the Constitutional Convention. The framers feared anarchy and monarchy both equally. Funny enough, Hamilton wanted a hereditary president with lots of power. Others wanted a plural executive. Basically, multiple people acting as several, like a council presidents or something like that. This. If you're wondering why did they want a weak executive, you have to remember that most states had very weak governors and very strong legislatures. They finally agreed on a fairly powerful American president. This was helped by the assumption that Washington would be basically a Cincinnatus. He would not become a tyrant. The Electoral College itself was a mishmash. The Electoral College was a mishmash innovation. The founders were scared of direct election, the fear of mobs and big state dominance. They didn't want the president to be however, they did not want the president to be a creature of Congress. But they expected most elections would end up in the one state, one vote House of Representatives. Basically, that's how they would vote. Basically, the House of Representatives each state would get one vote in the House of Representatives when they choose the president, because they thought each state would pick a favorite son. But national parties did away with favorite sons. If you're wondering what a favorite son is, it's kind of like a state's favorite politician for offices. An example of a favorite son would be Henry Clay. So, the original system worked fine for Washington because, he was elected unanimously, but in the Electoral College. However, it collapsed in 1796 when Federalist Adams was elected president and Republican, and the Federalist Adams was elected president, and Jefferson, his main opponent, was elected vice president. This, as you can imagine, caused all sorts of headaches. The electors voted as delegates on straight party lines, not as free agents or trustees. 1800 was an even bigger disaster, as all Republican electors voted for both Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, resulting in a tie. Burr, was pushing to become president, but Hamilton sabotaged his efforts, and by pushing the House to finally pick Jefferson as the president. But it still took them 36 ballots. Burr, funny enough, if you know, was the guy who killed Hamilton and also wanted to annex Mexico. So I don't know if it would have been very, it probably would have not been too good if he became president, because we could have been embroiled in a bunch of wars. The 12th Amendment fixed things by separating ballots for president and vice president. Fun fact, Adams would have been re-elected if not for the Three-Fifths Clause. So the Three-Fifths Clause gave the South a lot more power than they should have gotten in terms of population. So the relative power of the two political branches has waxed and waned. Congress usually takes leads except in a war or crises. Relatively powerful presidents include Jackson, Lincoln, Cleveland, Theodore Roosevelt, Wilson, FDR, and LBJ. Presidents that dominate foreign affairs and war, but has little influence over the budget. However, but the overall power, funding, and expectations of national government in general shot up during the New Deal and has continued to grow, especially with Johnson's Great Society programs. So, the president has multiple roles. He is the chief head of state of the government, and is must be present at very important ceremonies like state funerals or state meetings and whatnot. Kind of like the Queen of England. Sorry, Sorry, I just had to, my dad was calling me down. I thought my dad said something, but don't worry about it. So he's also the president's also the chief executive, the most powerful, basically he's the most powerful office in the world just because of the fact that he commands the most powerful country in the world. The U.S. president both reigns and rules. He's also a chief administrator, as he manages 2.7 million civilian employees and millions of others who are basically who work for others who indirectly work for the federal government. He's also the chief diplomat, as being the foreign policy architect and a spokesperson in the United States. He's also the commander in chief, leading 1.4 million military personnel. He's the chief legislature, as he's a shaper of the congressional agenda. He's the chief of the party, as being the source of much real power. And he's the chief citizen, as a representative of all of the people. So technically, in terms of formal qualifications, they tend to be natural born. That means they have to be born a U.S. citizen, and they cannot have been naturalized. Now, there's of course an open question if foreign-born U.S. citizens from birth, like John McCain or Ted Cruz, can be president. So there's that kind of like hazy ground. They must be at least 35 years old. Most getting elected in their 50s. Trump was the oldest. Teddy Roosevelt and Kennedy were the youngest. And they must be 14 years a resident of the United States, not continuously. Now, these are almost informal qualifications just because of how prevalent they are, many presidents. Most presidents tend to have served in the military for at least 2 years. Think of TR, Eisenhower, Truman, I know, served in the First World War and whatnot. Presidents almost tend to be at least half Protestant. We've only had one non-Protestant president, John F. Kennedy. He was a Catholic, and he had to deal with a lot of anti-Catholic discrimination when he ran for office. People were accusing him he would be loyal to the Pope rather than to America, and he had to launch an aggressive campaign to counter those stereotypes. They also tend to have a net worth of over $1 million because you have to be wealthy to campaign for president, and to have that much, and to even start and even to get influence. The presidential term is 4 years. It was originally constrained to 2 terms by George Washington's precedent. However, FDR broke the precedent/custom and won 4 terms. As he put it, better a third term than a third rater. Grant also tried for a third term but failed. Now the 22nd Amendment now limits a president to 2 terms and half to 2 terms. Now, some argue amendments make president a lame duck in the second half of the second term, and as a result, these people argue that a president should have 1 6-year term to reduce the issue of the president being on a permanent political campaign. So, the president gets pretty good benefits, not in terms of salary, of course. $400,000 is a pittance compared to a Fortune 500 CEO. Not to mention the fact that most people who run for president, for example, FDR have a lot of money, generally have a lot of money. FDR never really had to work a single day in his life. Was sitting on a big pile of cash. Similar of Kennedy, his family was very wealthy. But they get solid fringe benefits like Air Force One and a nice house. They also make millions of books and speaking tours after office. For example, Clinton with his speaking tours. Grant, I know, saved himself from bankruptcy by writing his autobiography, which became a bestseller. But unlike in kleptocracies, people usually don't run for president for the money because, like I said, $400,000 isn't really much. Interestingly, though, there have been presidents who actually relied on the salary to make a living, like Grant and Truman, because they just didn't have a lot of liquidity on them. So, Federalist Paper 70 is considered one of the most important Federalist papers in terms of outlining the president. Hamilton wrote this, saying that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. In the legislature, the promptitude of decision is more often an evil than a benefit, but it's not so much in the executive. Plural executives destroy responsibility, since executive power is more easily confined when it is one. In short, republicanism requires a strong executive department vested in one personality. So, presidents also have the power to persuade. The perception of power yields more power. Presidents need to come off as smart, sure themselves, and shrewd from the get-go to show others they are powerful. Truman, Ford, and Carter didn't really create that aura. Now, these were all smart people, so they weren't very good at creating that personality. the bully pulpit, or basically using the office to promote public causes, to promote certain political causes. This phrase was, in fact, this role and role and idea was pioneered by Theodore Roosevelt, fun fact, and going public are key tools, but they have a limited impact. Now, Woodrow Wilson reinstated the State of the Union address. Basically, he reinstated the tradition of actually physically appearing before Congress to give the State of the Union, whereas most previous presidents had just written a speech and just submitted it to Congress, and a congressional aide would just read it out loud. They only really get 100 days to get things done before campaigning takes over. This is known as the honeymoon period. And the president's party usually loses House of Representative seats in the midterm elections. During presidential election years, president and his party's members of Congress tend to rise and fall together. However, this coattails impact is, coming into question. Presidents tend to lose popularity over time, except for Clinton, but that's because the economy was improving under his presidency thanks to, the tech boom. So, as you can see, presidential victories and votes on Congress tend to occur at the beginning of the presidency, because that's when, the president is just elected, everyone likes him, yada yada yada. Obama, as we can see, Obama's success plummeted. Usually these big plummets in general, not just Obama's, is during the midterm, is after the midterms when the president's party loses seats in Congress. So the president also has the right to say no. It's obviously it includes the veto, which is only overridden 4% of the time, and a pocket veto, which basically means the president will not look at it or do anything with it and just wait for the bill to die. Now, this could only happen at the end of a 2-year congressional cycle. There's also something governors have this power to do something called line item veto, which they can veto certain provisions of the bill, but presidents don't have this power. So most presidents use something called the signing statement, which is a way around prohibition, which is basically a way around this. Basically, the signing statement is when the president says, I want the bill to be executed in this manner, that manner. And kind of like a line item veto, which you can pick and choose. It was used extensively by George W. Bush. It's very questionable constitutionally. They also have executive privilege, keeping information, the right to keep information private, so the president can get candid advice. However, it was not allowed in Watergate. Also, impoundment of funds. They can also say no to certain funds appropriated by Congress. Basically, if Congress says you must appropriate X number of dollars for this new project, the president can say, "Screw you! I'm not using that money." But this is really rare because it doesn't look good. Presidents have very different, presidents, depending on the personality of the person in office, have very different leadership styles. You can either have a very tight or loose, tight or loose one, which basically the president can either be really stringent the rules, or the president can be very lax. Some presidents have a chief of staff in which you have to go for in order to see him. Others just really don't give a crap. There's also the personal versus the bureaucratic. Some presidents like to work for very much have it incorporate a bureaucracy into their leadership style, whereas others tend to be more informal and congenial. You also have an insider versus outsider, but you also have some people rely a lot on insiders, others rely on a lot of outsiders, and these leadership styles tend to evolve over time. And these are just some notable examples. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through a lot of these, but some examples would it'd be Dwight Eisenhower being an ex-general. He very much he created a stringent hierarchy and implemented a strong chief of staff system. Ronald Reagan was famously decentralized. George H.W. Bush heavily relied on him being him being very involved in the federal government for years. For example, he was a director of the CIA. He would employ very much he would kind of move away from the Ronald Reagan decentralized mentality. Clinton was very informal. Johnson was very much known using intimidation. Nixon did not trust many members of the federal bureaucracy. He hated the State Department, so he often went around with his own personal advisors, like Henry Kissinger, as his real department head, who was a national security advisor and later Secretary of State, as his true Secretary of State in a way. So the organization of the executive branch can be split into two ways. The White House office, who are 500 people, roughly 500 people handpicked by the president. The Senate has no say in who these people can be. They include many past loyal campaign aides, and there is a hard jockeying for proximity and access. Basically, what's the thing is, where your office is located in relation to the president's office symbolizes how much power you have in the president's inner circle. These people have enormous amounts of power. And the organization could be either a pyramid structure, kind of like what Eisenhower had. You must see the chief of staff in order to see access to the president, or a circle, kind of like under Clinton, where it's like, I don't really care. Just, you don't have to meet for a chief of staff, or an ad hoc organization, which is very informal. Now, the executive office of the president, these are not in the White House people. Some need Senate approval. The Office of Management Budget is the key component. You also have the National Security Advisor, Director of National Intelligence, and the Council of Economic Advisors. The cabinet comprises of 15 major. So the organization, I should have said, sorry, the organization, the executive branch is, split into many different parts. These are not the only two parts, obviously. The cabinet's another major important part. These are 15 major executive departments. All top and near top jobs require Senate approval, but the president can fire these people on his own as they serve the pleasure of the president. They're not really part of the inner circle of the policymaking, surprisingly, and secretaries tend to represent the departments to the president more than the other way around. So these are the 15 department heads. And generally speaking, the way they sit is wait, never mind. I just forgot. You also have independent executive agencies, regulatory commissions, and government corporations. Leaders of many of these serve fixed terms that can only be removed for cause. This is supposed to remove partisanship because you don't want a partisan CIA or a partisan FBI or a partisan Federal Reserve. That would be very bad. So some independent agencies include the Tennessee Valley Authority, the USPS, NASA, EPA, Amtrak, FCC, FDIC, CIA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Federal Reserve. So the line of succession follows this: if the president is incapacitated or gets killed, or is simply found to be unfit for office, you have first goes the vice president, then the speaker of the House, then the president pro tempore, then the secretary of state, and the other cabinet heads in order of creation, as well as the 1947 Act of Congress. The 1947 Act of Congress and the 25th Amendment helped clarify some line of succession issues. The amendment confirms successors are not acting but real presidents. So the 25th Amendment also answers disability question. This was a real issue at times because you had Garfield getting shot, Wilson came down with Spanish flu, and Eisenhower had an illness, and modern anesthesia complicates matters. The vice president becomes acting president when or if either president informs the Congress he is or will be disabled, or if the vice president and majority of cabinet do so. The president needs to write to Congress to tell them when, if he or she is okay. If the vice president, majority of cabinet, and majority of Congress, both houses, dispute that the president is okay, the vice president stays as acting president. This has been discussed as an alternative to the impeachment trial to remove an unfit president. So impeachment is analogous to a criminal indictment. It's not a formal conviction though, as it takes 2/3 of the Senate to convict. And presidents who have been impeached were Johnson, Clinton, and Trump. Nixon wasn't impeached because he resigned before the House adopted pressed articles of impeachment, which they almost certainly would have. So the vice presidency was basically like a last-minute addition to the Constitution with really few duties. They really mostly just break ties to the Senate, and they help decide questions of presidential disability. They don't really have much power, but with the notable exception of Dick Cheney, but they're only a heartbeat away from becoming president, as 8 presidents have died in office. Part of the problem is that vice presidents are invariably chosen to balance the ticket, not because they'll be the best president in waiting. Great example being Harry Truman. Roosevelt, Truman was kind of like an unknown person, senator. And they just FDR just threw it onto the Democratic ticket because they're like, well, he's a stubborn Democrat. We need the stubborn Democrat to get their votes. Here we go. Also, president can't fire a vice president, and as a result, is a bit threatened by the vice president's presence. This is just a list of vice presidents who succeeded to the president. So presidential amendments are like Amendment 12, which altered the procedures of the Electoral College, like we said before. The change allowed separate balloting for president and vice president to avoid a tie in electoral votes, as happened in the election of 1800. The 20th Amendment shortened the time between elections and when presidents and members of Congress take office. These changes reflected the improvements in transportation, which allowed for easier travel to Washington. It also reflected the desire to avoid lame duck periods in the transition from one administration or session to another. This, was passed during, the height of the Great Depression when, Hoover lost and the president had to make a newly elected FDR to wait several months in order to become president, and people are wondering, why the hell do we need to wait for the president to come into office so long for the president to be sworn in when our country is melting? The 22nd Amendment imposed a two-term limit on presidential terms. This amendment was passed following the 4-term presidency of FDR to institutionalize the 2-term tradition established by Washington. The 23rd Amendment provided electors for the District of Columbia. The Electoral College was originally based upon electors representing states. As the population of D.C. grew, it was decided that the residents there deserved to have the opportunity to vote for electors in the presidential elections. Amendment 25 addressed presidential succession and disability. LBJ, who had a history of heart problems, took office following the assassination of JFK. As with other presidential successions, this left the office of the vice president vacant. The 25th Amendment clarified that a successor to the presidency was designated as President of the United States and included provisions for filling the office of VP. It also outlined procedures to be used in case of presidential disability. So that is it for Chapter 14.